General Motors, GM, has announced the closure of at least 5 of its plants in North America, including 4 in the US and 1 in Canada. The company is rewriting the rules to cut costs and focus on electric vehicles, with GM committing $35 billion to electric and autonomous vehicle development. This move is already reshaping how the company operates across its global footprint. GM's future envisions is not anchored in the same American manufacturing hubs that built its legacy. Instead, it is downsizing its traditional internal combustion engine infrastructure, which has employed generations of workers in cities like Detroit, Warren, and Lordstown. These facilities no longer fit the direction it's headed, and the message is clear. The age of gasoline is over, and the EV era won't be built in the same places. GM is reallocating resources to EV-focused production centers, such as Factory Zero in Detroit and Ham Ramp in Spring Hill, Tennessee, converting them into high-tech hubs for battery-powered vehicles. These sites will not replace the volume of jobs lost in the transition, as EV production requires fewer workers due to simpler drivetrains and greater automation. GM's decision to close 5 plants in North America signals a corporate reshaping to compete with tech giants and rival automakers. Mary Barra, the president's wife, may have anticipated this reaction and expected similar comments from Trump. In conclusion, General Motors' decision to close 5 plants in North America is a significant step towards a clean energy future, challenging the traditional manufacturing strongholds that once defined the company. General Motors, GM, is focusing on the electric future, with key models like the Cadillac L and Silverado EEV vehicles being launched. These vehicles are designed to keep pace with the market and lead it, with the Lyriq, an all-electric luxury SUV, and the Silverado EV being the company's heavyweight EEV play in the truck segment. To make this rollout work, GM is rebuilding its supply chain from the ground up, investing heavily in battery plants and raw material sourcing. One standout move is the $650 million investment in the Thacker Pass lithium project in Nevada, which secures first rights to the output as a hedge against global supply instability. As EV competition ramps up and battery-grade lithium prices remain volatile, Trump is pushing for more tariffs on auto MP imports, which would affect vehicles and parts coming from Canada and Mexico. Around 30% of GM vehicles sold in the US last year were assembled outside the country, which becomes a liability under Trump's renewed trade war posture. Tariffs would raise costs, disrupt production schedules, and potentially delay the EV transition. GM is aggressively chasing Trump's argument, which is based on bringing jobs back and punishing companies that offshore manufacturing. However, GM is building a flexible global network that reflects how EEVs actually get made, as batteries require different logistics than engines. Materials like cobalt, lithium, and nickel come from Congo, Australia, and Chile, and trying to jam EEV production into an old-school manufacturing mold could derail progress. GM is future-proofing itself by doubling down on domestic resource access, diversifying global partners, and locking in deals that keep production flowing even under policy swings. While Trump's tariffs might rattle the market, short-term GM is playing a longer game, not waiting for Washington to get on board while pushing toward a global supply strategy and tech-forward operations. Tensions brewing between GM and Trump have escalated during a meeting in March 2025. Mary Barra reportedly came in with data projections and a clear roadmap for GM's ongoing investments in electric vehicles and battery technology, emphasizing their commitment to reshaping the company into a global EEV leader. Trump, however, is skeptical of subsidies and is openly considering ending them. The $7,500 federal EV tax credit is a move that would hit companies like General Motors, GM, hard, especially as they ramp up mid-range EV production. Insiders say the tone of the meeting was tense, with Trump pushing economic nationalism and Barr sticking to a pragmatic, data-driven defense of global strategy and innovation. The White House painted the meeting as a tough but productive conversation, suggesting that GM was given a chance to get back on track. The market's reaction was split, with investors trying to make sense of what it meant for a company that spent the last 5 years pivoting toward electric vehicles with a globally interconnected supply chain. As the tariffs are reality, GM's cost structure is shifting dramatically, especially considering that roughly 30% of the vehicles it sells in the US are made in Mexico and Canada. Analysts warn that ongoing trade friction could slow GM's EV momentum, forcing the company to rethink production timelines and renegotiate key supply contracts. Public sentiment is deeply divided. with some viewing GM as betraying American workers by cutting domestic jobs while investing billions in automated plants and foreign ventures, while others argue that clinging to outdated production models risks leaving the U.S. behind in swing states like Michigan and Ohio. Union leaders have criticized the company for prioritizing profits over people, while others note that Trump's tariffs introduce uncertainty that drives manufacturing abroad. Both Trump and GM claim to be defending American jobs from opposite directions. The debate shows no signs of cooling while investors argue over long-term gains and voters debate loyalty. Ford CEO Jim Farley has publicly criticized President Trump's 25% tariffs on imported cars and parts, causing concern among automakers, economists, and consumers. The tariffs, which target all imported vehicles and auto parts, have already ripped through the market, forcing dealers, suppliers, and manufacturers to rework budgets, supply chains, and production strategies. Trump's stated goal was to bring back American manufacturing, but in practice, the automotive sector in the U.S. doesn't operate in the way many people think. Even vehicles labeled Made in America rely heavily on imported parts, which are often from countries like Mexico, Canada, and Japan. Automakers are preparing for price hikes and potential supply chain disruptions, with suppliers raising prices to offset the tariff costs. Analysts estimate that the average cost of a new vehicle could rise between $2,000 and $5,000 depending on the model and how many imported parts it used. The logic behind the tariff was to create a competitive edge for domestic manufacturing, but many US-based car makers don't have the infrastructure to suddenly replace imported components with domestic alternatives. Retooling factories, renegotiating supplier contracts, and ramping up local production isn't something that happens overnight or even over a few quarters. By the end of the first week of April, pressure was mounting, with dealers reporting slower inventory restocks, automakers recalculating costs, and suppliers warning clients about delays and potential job losses. The rollout of auto tariffs, which began just days after the COVID-19 pandemic, was a major disruption to the auto industry. Ford's CEO Jim Farley warned that the 25% tariffs were already affecting Ford's operations and could have long-term consequences for working-class Americans. Farley described the situation as a business problem and defended the livelihoods of thousands of American families. He presented internal forecasts showing a potential 8 to 10% drop in domestic sales over the next 2 quarters if the tariff costs were passed on to consumers. Farley also projected that up to 3,000 jobs could be at risk if production had to be scaled back due to falling demand and increased costs. He also warned that supply chain delays were becoming unavoidable, with components from Mexico and Canada becoming more expensive and harder to secure. Assembly lines might have to shut down temporarily, leading to lost hours, missed quotas, and delayed vehicle deliveries. Farley called for a collaborative approach between automakers and the federal government to shape a more balanced solution. He believed that a successful industrial strategy would require input from the people running the industry, not just politicians trying to score points. If the tariffs persist with Mexico and Canada, it would mean billions of losses for the domestic car industry, impacting millions of jobs in the U.S. U.S. manufacturers like Ford and General Motors are facing reduced profit margins due to tariffs on imported parts, leading to higher production costs. This has led to tighter margins and revisiting financial forecasts for the rest of the year. Reports from several automakers suggest potential factory slowdowns and shutdowns in specific regions, with Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee being most vulnerable. These states house major assembly plants and rely heavily on parts sourced from Canada and Mexico. Economists are warning that history could be repeating itself if these tariffs remain in place without relief or negotiation for workers. Some plants have warned employees about the possibility of short-term layoffs if part shipments are delayed or vehicle demand softens further. The electric vehicle sector is the biggest hit, as it depends on a complex web of imported materials, especially for their batteries. China is now the largest exporter of automobiles in the U.S., with over 20% of vehicles sold in Mexico being built in China. Ford has invested heavily in electric vehicles, committing billions to new factories, technology, and battery development. However, the 25 tariffs have disrupted these plans, as a significant portion of the materials and parts required to build EVs, especially lithium-ion batteries, electric motors, and electronic control units, are imported. The cost of producing an electric vehicle in the US could increase by $3,000 to $6,000 per unit under the current tariff structure, which is a massive problem for a market segment already sensitive to pricing electric vehicles. Ford risks losing momentum and changing the competitive landscape, while companies like BYD continue to dominate the global market with low-cost, high-volume production.